Sure. Here's part 1 explained in simple, interesting English, around 1,400 words, written as a flowing third-person story with no headings or extra text. The first sign of trouble came as a whisper. It was so faint that even the most advanced scanners barely caught it. Somewhere deep in the communication room of a small mining colony, a light flickered on Mara Vance's screen. At first, she thought it was just another static wave from the storm outside. The planet's atmosphere was thick with dust and electricity. Storms raged for days, cutting off radio signals and power lines. But this time something was different. The flicker repeated, 3 short bursts, 3 long, 3 short again. SOS Mara leaned forward, her fingers hovering over the control panel. Her heart began to race. SOS signals were old-fashioned, rarely used anymore. Most distress calls were encrypted data bursts, not simple Morse code. Whoever sent this was desperate, or old school enough to know that even when every network failed, an SOS could still travel through static. She amplified the signal, but the message was weak, half broken by interference. All she could make out was a voice, cracked and barely human through the distortion. Colony. Under siege. Supplies gone. Anyone. Please. Then silence. For a long moment she just sat there, staring at the empty screen. The storm outside howled like a living thing, shaking the walls of the outpost. The lights flickered again, the backup generators struggling to keep up. Mara took a deep breath and hit record, saving the signal. She checked the time. 0213 local. The night shift. Most of the other crew were asleep or pretending to be. Only the low hum of machines and the occasional thud of wind against the metal hull kept her company. She tried sending a response, but the transmitter crackled and died halfway through. The antenna array outside had taken heavy damage in the last storm. Half the colony's systems were down. Food was running low. Oxygen scrubbers were failing, and the last cargo ship had left 3 months ago, promising to return soon. No one really believed it would. Mara rubbed her tired eyes. She was 27, one of the youngest officers on the base, but she already felt twice her age. When she first signed up for frontier duty, she had imagined adventure, new worlds, discovery, purpose. What she got instead was isolation, endless dust, and the constant fear of being forgotten. Still, she stayed. Someone had to keep the comms online. Someone had to keep the hope alive. She checked the transmission logs again. The SOS didn't come from their own colony. It was coming from somewhere beyond the storm belt, an outpost that wasn't even on their standard charts. That meant one of 2 things. Either it was a lost civilian ship or a rogue settlement that had gone off-grid. Neither was good news. The nearest official rescue ship was at least 3 weeks away, and even if they got the message, the storm zone would make any approach almost impossible. She stood up and looked out through the reinforced glass window. Lightning tore across the dark sky, illuminating the jagged rocks and metal wrecks scattered across the landscape. The colony was small, just 37 people, including engineers, miners, and a few children who played in the old cargo tunnels. Every one of them depended on her for any contact with the outside world. And right now, the outside world was silent. She thought of waking Commander Dalen, the colony head, but hesitated. He had stopped listening weeks ago. When the supply drops didn't arrive. When the first case of sickness spread through the lower levels, he locked himself in his quarters, muttering about containment and protocol. The rest of the crew looked to Mara more than to him now, though she was only supposed to handle communications. Leadership had a strange way of choosing people. It didn't always pick the ones in charge. Her gaze went back to the flickering light on the console. The SOS was still looping. She bit her lip, then made a decision. If no one else was coming, she would send out a broad-range distress beacon herself. Maybe, somewhere out there, someone would hear. Maybe another colony, a trader ship, anyone. She switched to the emergency frequency, overriding local control. Her hands moved quickly, typing the code that would activate the long-range transmitter. The system warned her of power shortages, but she ignored it. The hum of energy filled the room, lights dimming as the signal core powered up. "This is Mara Vance, Communications Officer, Frontier Colony Theta 9, she said into the microphone, her voice steady despite the pounding of her heart. "We have received an SOS signal from an unknown source beyond the storm belt. Our own situation is critical. Supplies are nearly exhausted and we've lost external contact. Requesting any available response from nearby ships or settlements. Repeat, this is Theta 9. Broadcasting emergency distress call." She released the button and listened. Nothing. Just static. She sent it again, then again. After the 5th attempt, she slumped back in her chair. The signal would travel, bouncing through relays and satellites, at least the ones that were still functional. Beyond that, it was up to luck. The storm outside grew louder, the metal walls creaking like the groan of an old ship. Mara shut off the overhead lights and sat in the glow of the console. The silence between thunderclaps was heavy. Somewhere deep below, she could hear the faint hiss of air leaking from a damaged pipe. The colony was dying, and they all knew it. The SOS she'd received wasn't just someone else's cry for help. It was a mirror of their own. Hours passed. She dozed off once or twice in her chair, jerking awake at every strange noise. At one point, she thought she saw movement outside the window, a shadow against the lightning, but it was just the wind kicking up debris. Sleep-deprived imagination. Still, she couldn't shake the feeling that something or someone was listening out there in the storm. By morning, the power grid was down to 30%. The mess hall smelled of stale air and recycled food paste. A few crew members wandered in, pale and hollow-eyed. They didn't ask about the signal. They didn't need to. Everyone had seen the flickering light in the sky last night. Hope was dangerous out here. It kept you alive, but it also broke you faster when it failed. Mara forced a smile and handed a ration pack to a young engineer named Nilo. "Keep your head up," she said softly. "Maybe today we'll get lucky." "Lucky?" Nilo gave a bitter laugh. "Out here, luck's just another word for dying slower." When he left, Mara turned back toward the comms room. The words echoed in her mind, dying slower. She refused to believe that was all there was. Someone would hear. They had to. She checked the transmission log again. Still no reply. The system showed her message had gone out successfully, but no return ping. It could take hours, days, or forever. She sat back down, letting the quiet settle around her. The air inside the comms room was cool and dry, filled with the soft hum of machines. It was the sound of life, faint but constant. Outside, the storm never stopped. It was a cruel world, one that punished weakness and swallowed the unprepared. That's why they called such planets Deathworlds, places where even breathing could be a battle. As she adjusted the radio settings, her fingers brushed over the ewe. Old charm tied to the console, a tiny metal feather dulled with age. Her brother had given it to her before she left Earth, saying it would remind her to keep flying no matter how heavy the sky got. He'd been a pilot, part of the early exploration fleets. His ship had vanished beyond known space years ago. Sometimes, late at night when the storms screamed loud enough to sound like voices, she imagined he was out there still, flying, listening, waiting. She looked back at the faint SOS trace on her screen. Whoever sent it must have been terrified. Maybe it was a colony like theirs, cut off and forgotten. Maybe a lone survivor trapped in a wreck, maybe children huddled in the dark. Her heart clenched at the thought. She couldn't ignore them. Even if she couldn't save herself, she had to try to save someone. Over the next few hours, she fine-tuned the signal, cleaned up the static, and tried triangulating its origin. The data was patchy, but she managed to narrow it down to a region known as the Iron Belt, a cluster of shattered moons and metallic asteroids about 2 systems away. It was a dangerous route, one avoided by traders and even military ships because of debris storms and magnetic interference. But it was the only lead she had. As the sunless day dragged on, she watched the skies, hoping for any sign of movement. Her eyes burned from lack of sleep, but she couldn't leave the console. At one point, the signal spiked briefly. Something had pinged back, but it vanished before she could confirm it. Maybe a ship. Maybe just atmospheric distortion. She recorded it anyway. By nightfall, her throat was dry, her stomach empty, and her body trembling with exhaustion. Yet inside, something had shifted. For the first time in weeks, she felt a purpose stronger than survival. She wasn't just waiting to die anymore. She was part of something bigger, the faint connection between the lost and the hopeful, between the living and those calling out in the dark. When she finally closed her eyes for a moment's rest, the transmitter light still blinked steadily, pulsing in rhythm with her heartbeat. The message was out there now, drifting across the void. And though she didn't know it yet far beyond the storm belt, someone had indeed heard it. Someone who lived where no one else dared to. Someone the rest of the galaxy called Deathworlders. The message drifted through space for days, bouncing off broken satellites, dying relays, and forgotten beacons. It was weak, a ghost of sound traveling through the emptiness between worlds. Most systems ignored it, machines too damaged or too old to care. But then, somewhere deep in the outer belt, a scavenger ship picked it up. Its hull was covered in burn scars, its engines patched with stolen parts, and its crew were the kind of people who lived where no one else dared. They were called Deathworlders, not because they were killers, but because they came from places where everything tried to kill them. The ship's name was the Vandal's Grace, though grace was the last thing it had. Inside, the air smelled of metal, sweat, and recycled filters. The crew was a mix of humans and other species hardened by survival. They didn't have uniforms, only scars and stories. At the center of it all sat Commander Rotarchus, a man with a face like stone and eyes that had seen too many battles. He was human once, from a world so harsh it had burned away his fear and left only instinct. Ro sat in the pilot's chair, half asleep when the console beeped, a sound so rare that everyone on board froze. Jessa, the youngest crew member, rushed to check the screen. "Captain," she said, her voice trembling, "we've got an incoming signal. Civilian frequency. Looks like an SOS." Ro groaned. "Probably another trap," he muttered, rubbing his eyes. Out here, pirates sometimes used fake distress calls to lure ships close enough to ambush them. He had fallen for that once years ago, and lost half his crew. Never again. But Jessa didn't give up. "No, sir. Listen to this." She pressed a button, and a faint voice filled the cabin. The sound was broken, fading in and out, but they could all hear it. Mara's voice, calm but desperate. "This is Theta 9 Colony. Receiving SOS. Under siege. Anyone, please respond." The words hung in the air. For a moment, no one spoke. "Turn it off," Ro said, but no one moved. Even old Garen, the ship's mechanic who never cared about anything but engines, stared at the console. There was something in that voice, something real. Not a pirate's bait, not a machine recording, but a human being calling for help. Jessa frowned. "Sir, what if it's real? What if they're out there waiting for someone to answer?" Ro leaned back in his chair. His left hand, covered in burn scars, drummed against the armrest. He had seen this story before. Colonies lost, people begging for help, no one coming. He told himself long ago that he wasn't a savior. He was just a survivor. That was how Deathworlders lived. You saved yourself, or you didn't live long enough to regret it. Still, that voice wouldn't leave his head. There was something steady about it, something that reminded him of the soldiers he once fought beside. People who didn't scream or beg, they just kept going until they couldn't anymore. "Pull up the coordinates," he finally said. The crew exchanged glances. Jessa's face lit up with hope. "Aye, Captain." It took hours to clean the data. The signal was broken and distorted by storms and distance. Finally, a rough map appeared on the screen, an isolated planet near the Iron Belt. The readings were bad. Toxic atmosphere, violent weather, and magnetic interference strong enough to fry unshielded ships. "Looks like a death world," Garen said with a grim smile. Ro nodded slowly. "Fitting." He stood up and looked around at his crew. There were only 8 of them, all worn by years of danger and loss. They had no orders, no flag, no home. Just a ship and a name that meant they didn't die easy. This isn't a job, Ro said. There's no reward waiting for us. If we go, we do it knowing we might not come back. Story of our lives, Garen muttered. Jessa looked at Ro, her eyes shining. We're Deathworlders, sir. We don't run from the hard ones. A low laugh rippled through the crew. Even Ro couldn't help a small grin. Plot a course, he said. Let's see who's calling for help. As the Vandal's grace powered up, the engines roared like beasts waking from hibernation. The ship trembled, then broke free of its orbit, leaving behind a trail of blue fire. Outside the windows, stars streaked past, and the endless dark swallowed them whole. The journey wasn't easy. The Iron Belt was infamous for destroying ships. Massive chunks of rock drifted through space, colliding without warning. Magnetic storms flared across the region, confusing sensors and disrupting communication. But the crew of the Vandal's Grace had flown through worse. Hours turned into days. The further they went, the more unstable the readings became. The ship creaked as if it could feel the danger ahead. Jessa spent her time cleaning up the SOS recording, trying to piece together more of the message. One night, while Ro was checking the nav system, she came to him with something new. "Listen to this," she said quietly. She pressed play. The voice came again, clearer now. "We have lost all contact. Supplies low. If anyone can hear this, you are our last hope." Ro closed his eyes. He could picture her, alone, in some dark control room surrounded by failing machines, speaking into a radio that might never reach anyone. He remembered the faces of the people he'd left behind in other battles, other storms. "Keep the signal running," he said. "Let her voice guide us in." By the time they reached the edge of the storm belt, the ship's shields were flickering. The planet ahead was a dull red sphere wrapped in violent clouds. Lightning danced across its surface, so bright it could be seen from orbit. Garen whistled softly. "That's one angry world." Rose stared at it through the viewport. "Then it'll feel right at home." They prepared for descent. Every crew member checked their gear in silence. There was no fear on their faces, only focus. They'd all faced worse odds. That was what it meant to come from Deathworlds. You learned to fight the planet itself, not just the people on it. As they entered the atmosphere, the storm hit them like a living thing. The ship rocked violently, alarms blaring. Fire streaked across the windows as debris scraped against the hull. Jessa clung to her seat, teeth clenched. "Shields at 40%. Hold it steady," Ro shouted, gripping the controls. The ship dove lower, cutting through the turbulence. For a moment, everything went black. The power cut out completely. The only sound was the roaring wind and the crew's heavy breathing. Then, with a sudden jolt, the lights flickered back to life. They had made it through the first wave. When the clouds cleared for a few seconds, they saw the surface below, a wasteland of metal ruins and cracked earth. The colony's beacon was faint but visible, a tiny light in a sea of darkness. "There," Jessa whispered. Ro nodded. "That's our destination." They circled the area, scanning for life signs. The readings were weak, barely enough to register. But they were there. People were still alive. Something like relief crossed Ro's face, though he didn't show it long. "Prep the landing zone," he ordered. "We'll go in hard and fast. The storm won't give us a second chance." As the ship descended, the crew worked together with the precision of veterans. They were used to chaos. Each person knew exactly what to do, and they trusted one another completely. Even when the ship shuddered and alarms screamed, no one panicked. They landed roughly, the impact throwing everyone forward. Dust and sparks filled the cabin, but the engines held, and the hull didn't crack. For a Deathworlder ship, that counted as a perfect landing. Outside, the world was chaos. The wind howled with an almost human scream, tearing at their armor. The ground was littered with twisted metal, remnants of buildings and machines destroyed by storms. Visibility was poor, but through the haze, they could see faint lights flickering in the distance, the colony's main structure half buried under debris. Jessa tightened her helmet. They're still there. I can feel it. Ro looked at her, then out at the ruins. For the first time in years, he felt something he hadn't allowed himself to feel. Hope. Not for himself, but for the people waiting out there. For the voice that had called across the stars and somehow reached them. He motioned to his team. Move out. We're not leaving until we find them. And so, the Deathworlders, those who came from planets that tried to kill them every day, stepped out into another world that wanted them dead. They moved through fire, wind, and storm, drawn forward by a single human voice carried through the void. A voice that reminded them why they fought to live in the first place. Far above, the storm swallowed the sky again, hiding their ship from view. The Vandal's Gray stood silent, its lights flickering like distant stars. And though no one else in the galaxy knew it yet, the moment the SOS reached those who were born of death and danger, the fate of everyone on that dying colony began to change. Because when the Deathworlders heard the call, they didn't run from it, they answered. The storm was waiting for them. As soon as the Deathworlders stepped out of their ship, the world seemed to roar in anger. Wind slammed into them with such force that it felt like a living creature trying to shove them back into space. Dust and metal shards flew through the air, cutting across their armor like knives. The ground beneath their boots shook, cracking open in places where the lightning struck. Every sound was drowned by the endless howl of the storm. Commander Ro Tarkus led the way, moving like he had done this 1,000 times before. His helmet lights cut narrow beams through the swirling dust, guiding the others. Behind him followed Jessa, Garen, and 5 more of the crew, each one trained to survive in places most people wouldn't last an hour. They had seen many dangerous worlds, but this one was different. It felt alive, as if the planet itself didn't want them there. The scanners on Jessa's wrist kept flickering, confused by the magnetic interference. "Signal's weak," she shouted through the comms. "I can't get a clear fix on the colony's location." Ro didn't slow down. "Follow the beacon light we saw before. It's the only thing still standing." The air smelled of metal and ozone, and every breath inside their suits came with a hiss of recycled oxygen. As they moved forward, the ruins of the colony began to take shape through the haze. Half-collapsed towers, torn cables hanging like vines, and vehicles buried in mud. The ground was littered with debris, pieces of broken machinery that had once been part of life here. Now it looked like a battlefield. They stopped beside the remains of a large structure. Its roof had caved in and the walls were black with burn marks. Ro crouched down and examined the ground. "Explosive damage," he said. "Not just storm damage. Someone attacked this place." The others exchanged uneasy glances. Jessa swallowed hard. "You think they were raiders?" "Maybe," Ro said quietly. "But whatever happened, it's over now. Keep moving." They pressed forward, carefully stepping over twisted metal and fallen beams. Lightning flashed above them, lighting the sky in brilliant white for half a second, revealing the vast emptiness around them. There was no sign of life. No movement except the storm itself. Then faintly, Jessa's scanner beeped. "Wait, picking up faint energy signatures about 200 meters ahead." Ro raised a hand. "That's our lead. Double time." They moved faster, pushing through the wind until the faint glow of emergency lights appeared ahead. A bunker mostly intact, buried under layers of dust and rubble. Its entrance door was half sealed, jammed by fallen debris. "Help me with this," Ro said. Together with Garan, he pulled at the heavy metal door. The hinges screeched, refusing to move. Then with one final shove, it broke open just enough for them to slip through. Inside, the air was still and heavy. The storm's scream faded behind them, replaced by silence and the soft hum of old machines still running on backup power. The light inside was dim, flickering through cracked bulbs. Dust floated in the air like tiny stars. Jessa's voice came through the comm. "I'm detecting life signs." "Multiple just below us," Ro nodded. "Let's find them." They moved carefully through narrow corridors. The walls were lined with faded posters and cracked screens showing warning messages. Water dripped from pipes overhead. Everything smelled of rust and time. As they turned a corner, a sudden movement made everyone tense. A figure stepped out of the shadows, holding a metal rod like a weapon. The person's suit was torn and patched, their face hidden behind a cracked helmet. "Stay back," the stranger shouted, voice shaking. "Who are you?" Ro lifted his hand slowly. "We're not here to hurt you. We picked up your SOS. We came to help." The person hesitated. Then slowly they lowered the rod. "You heard it?" You actually heard it? Ro nodded. We did. Where's your leader? The figure took a shaky breath. Follow me. They were led deeper into the bunker. The hallways grew narrower, filled with the hum of old generators. Finally, they reached a large chamber where a dozen survivors huddled together near flickering heaters. Some were injured, their faces pale and eyes hollow. Others sat silently, too weak to stand. In the middle of them stood Mara Vance. She turned as the Deathworlders entered, disbelief flashing across her tired eyes. You came, she whispered, as if afraid saying it out loud would make them disappear. Ro took off his helmet, revealing a scarred, weathered face. You called, he said simply. We answered. For a long moment no one spoke. Then one of the children near the heater let out a small cry of relief. The silence broke. People began to rise, some weeping, some just staring in wonder at the strangers who had stepped out of the storm. Mara stepped forward. We thought no one would ever hear us. The transmitters are dying. We've been cut off for months. Ro looked around at the group. How many of you are left? 32, she said softly. There were more, but the sickness took some. Others went out to search for supplies and never came back. Garen crouched beside a broken power unit. The whole place is running on fumes, he muttered. If we don't move soon, these generators will fail. Ro nodded. Then we move. How far is your landing pad? North side of the colony, Mara replied. But the passage collapsed weeks ago. It's completely buried. Ro's mind was already working. We'll clear it. We brought tools and explosives for emergency routes. My people know how to handle unstable ground. Mara looked at him, a mix of hope and fear in her eyes. You're risking your lives for strangers. He gave a half smile. We've done worse for less reason. The Deathworlders got to work immediately. They split into teams, half helping the survivors gather what little they could carry, the other half setting up charges to clear the blocked passage. Every explosion shook the bunker, and dust rained down from the ceiling, but Ro's team moved with precision. They didn't panic. They worked like they had done this countless times before. Jessa stayed close to the survivors, helping bandage wounds and sharing her rations with the children. She smiled softly at one of them, a little girl clutching a cracked toy robot. Don't worry, Jessa said. We'll get you out of here soon. The girl nodded but didn't speak. She just stared at Jessa with wide, trusting eyes. Hours passed. The Deathworlders worked tirelessly, sweat pouring down their faces under their helmets. Outside, the storm continued to rage, pounding against the bunker walls like a furious ocean. Finally, Garen's voice came through the comms. We're through. Passage is open. Ro turned to Mara. Time to move. The survivors gathered quickly, carrying what little they had left, mostly memories and hope. Ro led them through the newly cleared tunnel. The air was thick with dust, but ahead, faint light broke through. As they emerged from the passage, the full force of the storm hit again. The Deathworlders surrounded the survivors, forming a shield around them as they made their way toward the landing zone. The ground shook under their boots, and the wind roared loud enough to make their helmets vibrate. When they finally reached the open field where the Vandal's Grace was waiting, lightning streaked across the sky, illuminating the ship like a giant shadow against the clouds. The ramp was down, engines burning bright to keep the area stable. Jessa ran ahead and guided the first group of survivors up the ramp. Go, 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 she shouted over the storm. Keep moving! Ro stayed at the rear, helping the slower ones. Mara was right beside him, holding onto a child with one arm and using her other hand to steady herself against the wind. A sudden explosion behind them made everyone duck. One of the old fuel tanks near the bunker had ignited, sending fire and debris flying into the air. The heat hit them like a wave. Move faster, Ro yelled. The Deathworlders didn't hesitate. They pushed forward, carrying those who couldn't walk, shielding them from the burning rain that began to fall. By the time the last group reached the ramp, the flames were closing in. Ro turned back once, watching the colony that had once been a home now burn under the angry sky. Then he stepped onto the ramp, hit the control, and the ship's door sealed shut behind him. Inside, the survivors collapsed, gasping for air, their faces lit by the warm glow of the ship's lights. For the first time in months, they felt safe. Jessa handed out water packs, her hands shaking but her smile steady. Mara stood there, still in shock, staring at the crew. You really came for us, she said softly. Ro nodded, taking off his helmet again. His face was streaked with sweat and dust, but his eyes were calm. "You called," he repeated. "We don't ignore that." Outside, through the ship's small viewing window, the storm still raged. But now it was just a backdrop, powerless to touch them. The Deathworlders had done the impossible. They had descended through hell itself to pull life out of the jaws of death. And as the Vandal's grace lifted off, leaving the burning ruins behind, Mara felt something she hadn't felt in a long time. Belief. The Deathworlders weren't myths or mercenaries. They were real, and when the SOS went out, they answered. The storm had not stopped. It chased them even after the ship took off, roaring across the sky like a wounded animal that refused to give up. The Vandal's grace shook violently as it climbed through the thick, burning clouds. Inside the ship, the rescued colonists held on to whatever they could, terrified as the lights flickered on and off. Children cried. Metal screamed. But through it all, Commander Rotarchus stayed calm, his voice steady over the chaos. "Hold tight," he said. "We're not done yet." The Deathworlders worked fast. Jessa was at the controls beside Ro, hands flying over the console as alarms blared. "Shields dropping to 20%, she shouted. Sparks burst from a panel near her feet, but she didn't flinch. Garan and 2 others were in the engine bay, trying to stabilize the power core. The storm's magnetic surges were tearing through their systems, threatening to shut the ship down completely. Mara sat near the middle of the cargo bay, surrounded by survivors. Her face was pale, her fingers trembling as she held a small boy close to her. The ship rattled so hard that every bone in her body seemed to vibrate. She looked at the crew moving around her, the Deathworlders still calm and focused even when death was seconds away, and she felt a strange sense of awe. How could they keep fighting like this? Ro's voice cut through the noise. "We're almost clear of the lower atmosphere, but we're running hot. Garan, talk to me." Through the comms came the mechanic's voice, strained but alive. "The reactor's overloading. We took a hit when that last lightning arc struck. I can reroute power, but we'll lose the stabilizers." "Do it," Ro said. "We'll take turbulence over fire." The ship jolted again. One of the side panels burst open, sending smoke into the cabin. Mara coughed, pulling the boy tighter against her chest. The lights flickered, then steadied. The smell of burning metal filled the air. "Captain," Jessa said, her voice tight, "we've got another problem. The reactor on the surface, it's going critical. I'm reading rising radiation levels. That colony's power core is about to blow." Ro froze for a moment. "How long do we have?" "Minutes, maybe less. When it goes, the shockwave will hit the atmosphere and tear through everything in range, including us." Ro cursed under his breath. "Set a course for high orbit. We need to clear the blast radius." Jessa's hands flew across the controls. The engines roared, pushing the ship upward. But then came another explosion from below. The colony's reactor had started to collapse. The sensors screamed with warnings. "The reactor's unstable," Garan yelled. "If it detonates while we're still in the upper layer, the radiation pulse will fry our systems." Mara heard every word. She looked at Ro, fear plain in her eyes. "You have to get us higher. Can't you just push the engines harder?" Ro's face was grim. "If I push harder, the ship will tear apart before we reach orbit." Jessa turned to him, desperate. "We could try manual venting. Redirect the overload through the auxiliary lines. But someone has to go down there and release the pressure valves by hand." Ro didn't even hesitate. "I'll do it." Jessa's head snapped up. "Captain, no. The radiation levels down there. Someone has to keep this ship flying," Ro said calmly. "You can't pilot and fix the reactor at the same time." "I can." Mara stood up, her voice shaking. "You can't go out there alone. There must be another way." Ro met her eyes. "There isn't." For a second, she saw something behind his hardened expression. Tiredness, yes, but also peace. The kind of peace that comes when a man already knows his place in the story. He turned to Jessa. "Keep the ship steady. If I don't make it back in 5 minutes, you take her out of the atmosphere, no matter what." Jessa's eyes filled with tears, but she nodded. "Aye, Captain." Ro grabbed his helmet and made his way toward the reactor chamber. The corridor lights flickered around him, casting long shadows against the metal walls. Every step echoed through the narrow passageway. Behind him, the ship groaned as if it knew what was coming. When he reached the reactor bay, Garan was still working frantically with tools and cables. His face was covered in sweat and grime. "What are you doing here, Ro? You should be up front." "Not this time," Ro said. "Get topside and help the others. I'll finish it." Garan hesitated, then understood. He gave a short nod. Good hunting, Commander. Then he ran. Rose sealed the chamber door behind him. The heat hit him instantly, intense and suffocating. The glowing core in front of him pulsed with blinding light, each surge stronger than the last. The temperature was rising fast. He could feel the radiation biting through his armor. He moved quickly, his hands steady even as alarms screamed around him. He pulled open the control panels, twisting valves, cutting power lines, rerouting energy to the outer vents. Sparks flew. A burst of fire licked across his arm, burning the suit fabric, but he didn't stop. On the bridge, Jessa was watching his vitals on her screen. "He's in the red zone," she said quietly. Her voice shook. "Radiation's spiking. He can't stay there much longer." Mara, still holding the child, looked toward the sealed door at the far end of the ship. "He's buying us time," she whispered. Rose's breathing grew heavier, but he kept working. One more valve, one more release. The ship trembled again as the reactor's light flared bright enough to turn everything white. He hit the last switch with all his strength. On Jessa's screen, the reactor reading suddenly stabilized. The overload was vented. The core stopped pulsing. "It's working," she cried. He did it. But then the communication line crackled with static. Rose's voice came through, faint and broken. "Jessa, get them out, now! Captain," she said, her heart pounding. "You need to get back. We're ready to launch." There was no answer, just the sound of wind and static. Then a final whisper. "Keep them alive." And then the signal went silent. Jessa's hands trembled. "No." Mara walked forward, placing a hand gently on her shoulder. "He knew what he was doing," she said softly. Her own eyes filled with tears. "Don't let his sacrifice be wasted." Jessa swallowed hard and nodded. She took a deep breath, wiped her eyes, and gripped the controls, engaging full thrust. "Let's get out of here." The Vandal's Grace roared to life once more. Its engines blazed blue, cutting through the dying storm. Below them, the colony's reactor finally gave way, erupting in a massive explosion. The blast tore through the atmosphere, sending waves of fire and lightning into the clouds. The shockwave hit the ship like a hammer, throwing it forward. Alarms went wild. The survivors screamed as the ship shook violently, but the Deathworlders held firm. Jessa's hands flew across the console, keeping the ship steady. "We're through the worst," she shouted. "Hold on." Outside, the fire faded to glowing clouds. The stars reappeared, distant and calm, as the ship finally broke free into the quiet of space. For a long time, no one spoke. The silence was heavy, full of things they couldn't say. Jessa finally leaned back, exhausted. Her hands dropped from the controls. "We made it," she whispered. Mara looked out through the viewing window. The planet below was still burning, orange and red like a dying ember. Somewhere down there, buried under the wreckage, was the man who had saved them all. She felt her throat tighten. "He stayed behind for us," Jessa nodded, tears running freely now. "He always said Deathworlders don't fear death. But that's not true. He feared it. He just never let it stop him." One of the children tugged on Mara's sleeve. "Is the captain coming back?" Mara knelt down beside him, her voice gentle but heavy with sorrow. "He's gone, sweetheart. But he saved us. That means he'll always be with us in here." She touched the child's heart. The boy nodded slowly, clutching her hand. Hours passed. The survivors were given food, water, and blankets. Some slept for the first time in months. Others sat quietly, staring at the stars. The Deathworlders worked in silence, repairing what they could, their movements slower now, weighed down by the loss of their commander. Eventually, Jessa went to the ship's central computer and opened the recording file Ro had left behind. His face appeared on the screen, tired but calm. His voice filled the cabin, quiet and steady. "If you're seeing this, it means I didn't make it back," he said. "Good. That means the mission worked. You're alive. That's what matters." He paused, looking into the camera. "Remember this, when someone calls for help, you answer. Doesn't matter who they are. Doesn't matter where they come from. You answer. That's what makes us more than survivors." The recording ended. The room stayed silent for a long time. Then Mara whispered, "He was right." Outside the ship, the stars stretched endlessly, calm and distant. The Deathworlders had lost one of their own, but they had kept their promise. They had answered the call, and in doing so, they had proven that even in the darkest corners of the universe, where death ruled and hope was rare, there were still those who would stand up, fight back, and choose to save others no matter the cost, and somewhere, in the fading light of the ruined planet below, it almost felt like the storm itself had quieted out of respect for the man who had defied it. Weeks passed after the explosion. The world that had once been a mining colony was now silent, a wasteland of blackened metal and broken stone. The fires had died, leaving behind ash that blew gently across the ground like gray snow. The sky was calmer now, washed clean by the storm. From orbit, the planet looked peaceful, almost beautiful, but the people who had escaped knew what it had cost. The survivors aboard the Vandal's Grace floated through space, heading toward a nearby settlement station where they would be safe. The journey was quiet. No one spoke much. The laughter that should have come with relief never arrived. Everyone was thinking about the man they had left behind, Commander Ro Tarkus. Mara often sat near the window, staring at the endless stars. Every time she looked into the darkness, she thought of him down there on the planet, standing in front of the reactor, his voice steady even when everything was falling apart. His last words still echoed in her mind, "Keep them alive." It wasn't just an order, it was a promise. Jessa was different now, too. She still flew the ship, still barked orders when repairs were needed, but the spark in her eyes was gone. Ro had been more than a captain to her. He was the one who had taught her how to survive, how to lead, how to care for others even when the universe didn't care for you. She wore his old flight badge pinned to her jacket. It was scratched and faded, but she touched it often like it kept her grounded. When they reached the nearest space station, the survivors were greeted by rescue officials. The government had finally responded to the SOS weeks too late. They offered medical help, food, shelter. The colonists stepped off the ship one by one, blinking under the bright lights of the docking bay. They were alive because of the Deathworlders, because a group of people known for violence and survival had chosen mercy instead. Reporters tried to question them. Who saved you? How did you escape? Who are the Deathworlders? But no one had clear answers. Mara only said, "They came when no one else would." That sentence spread faster than she expected. People across the nearby systems started whispering about it. Stories grew, about warriors from the most dangerous planets who answered a dying colony's call. Some called them mercenaries with hearts, others called them ghosts. But everyone agreed on one thing: they had done the impossible. A week later, the Vandal's Grace crew gathered on the planet's surface again. They had returned to the ruins not for salvage, but for something far more important. Mara wanted to build something there, something that would make sure Ro was never forgotten. The landing site was quiet. The wind moved softly through the wreckage. Bits of metal still gleamed in the pale light. The spot where the reactor had exploded was now a wide crater, filled with glassy rock and burned dust. It felt sacred, like the ground itself remembered what had happened. Jessa stood beside Mara, holding a small metallic device in her hands, a beacon. It was old, slightly damaged, but it still worked. "This was the one he used," she said quietly. "The same transmitter that sent the SOS back through the storm." "I found it in the wreckage," Mara nodded, her eyes soft. "Then it's perfect." They placed the beacon at the center of the crater. Around them, the survivors watched in silence. Some wept, others bowed their heads. Jessa activated the device. A faint hum filled the air and a small blue light flickered to life. Then a voice began to play, Ro's voice, faint and rough, the final recording he had made. "If someone's calling for help, you answer. Doesn't matter who you are." The voice echoed through the ruins. Even the wind seemed to pause. No one moved until the message ended. Then Mara whispered, "We'll call it the answering stone." Jessa smiled faintly through her tears. "He'd like that." They spent the next several days building around the beacon. They used parts of the old colony structures, metal walls, broken pylons, the remnants of the communication tower. Together they built a memorial. It wasn't large or grand, but it was strong, built by the hands of those who had survived. When it was finished, they engraved words into the metal base beneath the beacon. To those who answered the call. To those who never stopped fighting. To those who gave everything so others could live. Beneath that, a single name, Commander Ro Tarkus. As the group stood before it, the sky above turned golden. The sun broke through the clouds for the first time since the disaster. The light fell on the memorial, making the beacon shine like a star. Mara felt a lump rise in her throat. For the first time since that terrible day, she smiled. Word of the memorial spread quickly. Ships passing through the sector began to stop by the planet. Pilots, traders, even soldiers came to pay their respects. They left tokens, dog tags, flowers, or just small notes written on scraps of paper. Some whispered their own lost names into the wind, as if the stone could carry them to those they missed. The answering stone, as it came to be known, became more than just a monument. It became a promise. People began to send their own distress calls through its frequency, not for help but as a message of hope, to remind others that they were not alone. And sometimes when someone was truly in need, another ship would respond. Some swore those ships carried the same insignia as the Deathworlders. Years passed. The colony ruins turned into a place of remembrance. A small settlement grew nearby, built by people who wanted to honor what had happened there. They called it Tarkus Point. It wasn't rich or powerful, but it became a haven for travelers, refugees, and those seeking a new start. Every evening, the settlers would gather near the beacon and replay Ro's message. Even children knew it by heart. Mara stayed there. She became a teacher, telling the story of the Deathworlders to each new generation. Her hair turned gray over the years, but her voice stayed strong. She never forgot the way Ro looked in those final moments, calm, brave, and full of purpose. Jessa, on the other hand, returned to space. She took command of the Vandal's Grace and continued what Ro had started. The ship became a roaming rescue vessel, answering distress calls across the outer systems. Her crew grew, made up of people from different worlds, all united by one rule. If someone calls for help, you answer. Sometimes Jessa would fly back to Tarkus Point, landing near the answering stone. She'd stand there in silence, her jacket still carrying Ro's flight badge. She never said much. She didn't need to. The beacon's soft hum said it all. On one quiet night decades later, an old freighter drifted near Tarkus Point. The pilot was tired, lost, and running low on fuel. Then his radio picked up a faint signal, a repeating message from the surface below. If someone's calling for help, you answer, he smiled. Still out there, he said to himself. Then he changed course and landed on the planet. When he stepped out and saw the glowing beacon, he removed his cap and stood still for a long time. Around him the stars burned brightly, and the wind carried the whisper of voices long gone. Far away across the galaxy, ships continued to respond to SOS calls. No one knew if the Deathworlders still existed as they once were. Some believed they had vanished. Others believed they lived on, scattered among the stars, carrying forward the legacy of Ro Tarkus. And maybe they were right. Because sometimes in the darkest corners of space, when everything seemed lost, a mysterious ship would arrive. No markings, no registration, just a simple symbol carved into its hull, a single star surrounded by a broken circle. The mark of the Deathworlders. Wherever they came from, one thing was always true. They never asked for payment. They never explained why they helped. They simply came when the call went out. Back on Tarkus Point, Mara, now old and frail, sat near the answering stone one last time. The beacon glowed softly beside her, its light reflecting in her tired eyes. Around her, children played, their laughter echoing in the warm air. She smiled, knowing that the world Ro had died to protect had finally found peace. As the sun set, the beacon flickered once more, sending out its eternal message into the stars. If someone's calling for help, you answer. And far away among the endless night, a faint reply came through the static. We hear you. The signal traveled outward, crossing worlds, systems, and generations. It became more than a message, it became a way of life. Because as long as someone was willing to answer, there would always be hope. And so the story of the Deathworlders lived on, not in records or monuments, but in every act of courage that echoed that same belief. That no cry for help should ever go unheard. That no soul, however small or forgotten, should ever be left alone in the dark. Somewhere among the stars that truth still burned. Steady, eternal, unbreakable. Just like the man who had spoken it.